The woman stopped at the frozen door when the wolves began to beg. Mara's breath caught in the raw air as 8 massive shapes waited in the yard, their coats dusted with frost, their amber eyes fixed on her like they knew her name. One of them lifted a paw and scraped the ice from the porch boards, then nudged the door with its muzzle again. Not a growl. Not a threat. A plea. Mara tightened her grip on the woven basket at her hip and looked past them toward the dark house beyond the black iron fence. The place stood alone at the edge of the timberline, all sharp angles and shuttered windows, its stone walls holding the cold like buried winter. She had come this far because the village trail had vanished under snow, because the road back was too far, and because the old map in her coat pocket had pointed here with a trembling certainty she could not explain. The nearest wolf made a sound so low it seemed to come from the ice itself, then stepped aside from the threshold as if inviting her in. Mara glanced at the others. Their fur was silver-white and pale gray, thick as wool, and strange in the moonlight. They should have bolted the moment they saw her. Instead, they watched her with an unnerving patience, their paws leaving dark prints in the frost, their bodies forming a loose ring around the porch. "You want me to go inside," she murmured, more to herself than to them. The wolf by the door tilted its head. Another one lifted its nose, scenting her basket, the linen wrap, the small bundle of herbs she had carried up the mountain as if they mattered. Mara swallowed and pushed the door. It opened with a long, dry creak, releasing a breath of cold from the house, a smell of pine smoke, old wood, and something metallic underneath, faint but sharp enough to make the hairs on her arms rise. Inside was dim, lit only by the weak spill of firelight from a hearth somewhere deeper in the hall. The floorboards were black and polished by years of use. Heavy rugs lay folded near the entry, and a set of antler hooks held coats of dark wool and fur. No lamps. No voices. Only the hush of a house holding itself still. Mara stepped over the threshold, and the nearest wolf followed without sound, padding in after her. The door remained open behind them, framing the yard in a rectangle of moonlight and snow. She set the basket on a bench beside the wall, then noticed the smear of blood on the stone near the hearth. Not fresh, not bright, but enough to sharpen everything else in the room. A second later, a sound reached her from somewhere above, a hard knock, then another, like something striking wood from inside a wall. Mara turned toward the stairs. The wolves did too. Their ears angled forward. Their bodies shifted, subtle and tense. Then one of them began to change. It was small at first, a ripple beneath the fur, the visible tightening of muscle under skin, then a sharp, audible crack that made Mara freeze where she stood. The wolf braced its paws against the floorboards as bones changed shape in a terrible, impossible rhythm, shoulders widening, spine rising, muzzle pulling back into a jaw that was no longer shaped like an animal's. Mara stumbled one step backward and caught the edge of the bench. Another crack answered from the shadows. Then another. The room filled with the sound of shifting bodies, of breath drawn hard through clenched teeth, of paws becoming hands, coats folding into skin, and eyes, those same amber eyes, lifting now from taller, human forms. Mara's basket tipped, and dried lavender spilled across the floorboards in a pale arc. One of the newly formed men reached down and caught it before it could roll away. His hand was broad, scarred across the knuckles, and when he raised his head, the wolf's amber stare was still there in his human face. "Easy," he said, voice rough as bark. Mara stared at him, then at the others. 6 men now stood in the entry hall, barefooted on the cold floor, their shirts half-buttoned or thrown over one shoulder, their expressions alert and watchful. They were not strangers in the way strangers were known in villages. They carried the same stillness as the wolves had outside, the same contained force, as if the room itself had tightened around them. The oldest looking of the group turned toward the staircase, and the others made space without a word. From above came another sound, slower this time, followed by the groan of a floorboard. Then a man appeared at the top of the stairs. He moved like he owned the silence. Dark hair fell across one brow, and a long coat hung open over a fitted black shirt that did little to hide the breadth of his shoulders. His eyes were the same gold as the wolves, but colder, steadier, fixed on Mara with a focus that made the air seem narrower. He did not need to speak for the house to feel different around him. Even the men below lowered their gaze. Mara's fingers tightened around the basket handle. The man took the last steps down slowly, one hand resting on the rail, the other tucked behind his back. When he reached the bottom, he stopped close enough for her to catch the scent of cedar smoke, clean snow, and something deeper, wild, warm, unmistakably powerful. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I was told there was shelter." "By whom?" he asked. Mara looked toward the door behind her, where the snow still glowed pale in the moonlight. "The trail marker," she said. "It pointed me here." A flicker passed through his face, gone too fast to name. One of the men behind him said something under his breath, too low for Mara to catch. The man in black raised a hand, and silence fell at once. Then he stepped closer, his gaze dropping to the basket at Mara's side. "You came alone," he said. It was not a question. Mara nodded once. The room seemed to hold its breath. The man's eyes moved to the herbs scattered on the floor, to the blood near the hearth, to the open door and the wolves outside waiting like guards. Then, very carefully, he reached for the door and shut it with one solid pull. The click of the latch sounded final. Locked in with the warmth of the fire, the scent of fur and smoke, and the impossible truth standing in human skin before her, Mara felt the first clear drop of fear settle in her stomach. The man looked at her for a long moment, then at the others. "Find out why she was led here," he said quietly. "And keep her inside." Mara did not move when the latch clicked behind her. The room had gone still except for the low pop of the fire and the soft scrape of claws against wood somewhere beyond the wall. Heat rolled from the hearth in waves, carrying the scent of pine smoke, wet fur, and the sharp mineral bite of old blood dried into the floorboards. The men in the room watched her without speaking. Their shoulders were broad under dark coats, their boots leaving damp marks on the stone. Not one of them looked fully human for long. Their eyes kept catching the firelight with a strange pale sheen, and every few seconds one of them would tilt his head as if listening to something far away. Mara tightened her grip on the woven basket at her hip and took a careful step forward. Her boots touched a rug worn thin at the center, the wool rough under her soles, and the movement drew every gaze to her hands. "If you brought me here to punish me for the herbs," she said, keeping her voice level, "you can have them." The man in black did not answer at once. He stood near the table with one hand braced against the wood, his posture loose in the way a blade might rest before it struck. Moon-gray light slid through the shutters and caught the edge of his jaw. "We did not bring you here for herbs," he said. His voice was low, calm, and carried the kind of authority that made the room feel smaller. One of the men near the fire shifted his weight. Mara saw a line of tension run through him, quick as a flinch. "Then why?" she asked. The answer did not come from the man in black. It came from the oldest-looking one, whose hair was threaded with silver and whose fingers were stained dark from wood smoke. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and stared at the basket as if it might bite. "Because you walked in when every other human would have run." Mara glanced toward the door. Through the narrow crack in the frame she could still see the snow-heavy dark outside, the two wolves waiting just beyond the porch, their forms half lost in the white drift. They were enormous even at rest, their coats thick with frost, their breaths rising in pale clouds. One had lowered its muzzle to the step, as if guarding the threshold. The other had not once looked away from the windows. Mara set the basket on the table, slowly, so no one would mistake the motion for a threat. "I came because the injured man by the road said your house needed medicine." The room tightened. The silver-haired man's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Did he now?" he said. Mara realized too late that she had chosen the wrong words. The man in black's gaze sharpened, and the fire made his eyes look almost gold for a single blink. "What did he look like?" he asked. "Tall," Mara said after a beat. "Pale face. Dark coat. He was bleeding through the sleeve." A murmur moved through the room like a breeze through dry leaves. The older man looked at the man in black, then away, as if checking himself. Mara felt the shift without understanding it. The air had changed. Not colder, not warmer, just charged, the way it felt before lightning split the sky over the valley. The man in black crossed the room in 4 quiet steps and opened the basket. He lifted the cloth, checked the herbs, and ran 2 fingers over the bundle of yarrow and comfrey. His touch was exact, careful. Then he reached beneath the cloth and found the small glass vial tucked into the lining. Mara's breath caught. She had not remembered putting that there. This, he said, holding up the vial so the firelight flashed through the amber liquid inside, was not packed by accident. It's for fever, Mara said quickly. And for cuts. My grandmother used it. Your grandmother, he repeated, and there was something strange in the way he said it, like he was measuring the words against a memory he did not trust. He set the vial down and looked at her hands. They were red from the cold, the knuckles cracked, the nails rough with soil. Not hands made for jewels. Not hands that belonged in a palace or court. Just hands that knew how to gather roots in the dark and bandage a wound with shaking fingers. The oldest man rose from the bench with a creak of leather and wood. If she was sent by the roadman, then someone wants her inside our walls. Mara turned toward him. I wasn't sent by anyone. No, he said. Then why did the wolves step away from the path to let you pass? Mara opened her mouth, then shut it again. She had noticed them outside before she noticed the house. White shapes in the snow. Stillness in the trees. Watching eyes. But she had told herself it was fear making patterns of shadows. Now she looked at the man in black, and he looked back with that same unreadable steadiness, as if he had already decided she was either a risk or a key. The fire cracked loudly. One log shifted and shed a spray of sparks up the chimney. In that brief flare of light, Mara caught the edge of a mark at the man's throat, faint, silver, almost hidden beneath his collar, like a scar cut by moonlight. He saw her glance and drew the fabric down without changing expression. What is your name? He asked. Mara. Mara, he repeated, as if testing whether the name belonged here. Then he turned to the others. No one sends her back in this weather. The silver-haired man gave a short nod. Another man at the wall straightened at once, as if that was an order and not a suggestion. Mara stared at them. I can leave before dawn. The room answered with silence. Outside, wind pressed against the shutters hard enough to make them tremble. Somewhere beyond the porch, one of the wolves let out a low, warning sound. The man in black stepped closer until Mara could see the fine dusting of frost along the shoulders of his coat, melting into dark wool. Up close, his scent was stronger, pine sap, cold iron, and something wild held carefully in check. If you leave now, he said, you will not make it back to the road. That sounds like a threat. It is not. His gaze flicked to the door, then back to her. It is a fact. Mara's fingers tightened around the basket handle. Then tell me the truth. For the first time, the man in black hesitated. It was small, almost invisible. But it was there. The fire shifted, and the light moved across his face, revealing the strain beneath the calm. One of the men at the wall took a slow breath through his nose, as if catching a scent in the air. Then another. Mara felt it too, faint at first, then suddenly undeniable. Something in the room had changed the way a storm changes pressure before the rain falls. The man in black looked toward the ceiling, as if listening to something far above the house, beyond the beams, beyond the snow. His jaw set. When he spoke again, his voice had turned quieter, harder. Sit down, Mara. She did not. Why? His eyes returned to hers. Because the wolves outside are no longer waiting for us to decide. The words had barely fallen when the porch boards creaked under a heavy step, and the entire room turned toward the door at once. The knock at the door did not come once. It came twice, then stopped, as if whatever stood outside had pressed its weight against the wood and gone still to listen. Mara had already stepped back from the table, one hand braced on the edge of it, the rough grain biting into her palm. The room smelled of wet wool, chimney smoke, and the sharp pine resin clinging to the logs stacked by the hearth. Beyond the shutters, the wind dragged snow across the porch with a dry, whispering hiss. The man in black moved first. He crossed the room in 3 quiet strides and placed his hand flat against the door, not opening it, only feeling for something beyond it. The 2 men by the wall had straightened. One of them shifted his feet on the worn floorboards, and the boards answered with a tired creak. "Nobody speaks unless I do," the man in black said. His voice was low enough to vanish under the wind, but not low enough to hide the edge in it. Mara's gaze flicked to the knife on the table, then to the heavy latch, then to the shadow under the door, where cold air slid in like smoke. The porch light had been blown nearly out, but through the crack in the shutters she caught a flash of movement, white against black, fast and low, like a body moving through snow on all 4s. Then another shape. Then another. Not men. Not horses. Not animals she knew by name. The man in black pulled the door open only a hand's width. A gust shoved inside, carrying sleet, cedar, and the clean metallic scent of cold. For 1 second, Mara saw them clearly in the spill of lantern light, pale forms crouched on the porch, their shoulders broad beneath frost-dusted hides, their eyes fixed on the doorway with an unnerving stillness. They were wolves. Yet the way they held themselves was wrong for wolves. Too still. Too deliberate. One lifted its head, and the lamplight caught a line of muscle under the fur, a shape too human beneath the animal frame. Mara took 1 step back, her heel striking the leg of a chair. The sound snapped through the room. Every head turned to her. The man in black looked over his shoulder, and for the first time his control thinned enough for her to see something raw beneath it. Not fear. Calculation. "Don't move," he said. The largest wolf on the porch lowered its head, the breath from its muzzle turning silver in the freezing air. Then, in a motion so smooth it seemed impossible, its forepaw shifted against the boards. Claws vanished. Fingers appeared. Skin. A hand. Mara stared so hard the fire blurred at the edges. The second figure followed, shoulders rolling once beneath the pale coat before the shape changed again, bone and muscle sliding with a horrible grace that made her stomach tighten. The room seemed to shrink around the sound of the transformation, the soft crack of timber in the fireplace, the distant rattle of winter branches against the roof, the quick thud of Mara's own pulse in her ears. "Open the door," one of the wolves said. The voice was human now, deep and calm, but it held the same cold as the air outside. The man in black did not obey. "You're late," he said instead. "And you're not welcome inside." The answer came from the porch in a voice that was almost amused. "The storm decided that for us." Mara looked from one face to another, searching for an explanation in the lines of their mouths, their eyes, their stillness. None of them looked like the stories old women told to frighten children. No fangs bared. No snarling. Just men standing on a frozen porch, their breath smoking in the dark, and the strange certainty that the room had crossed into a boundary it did not know how to retreat from. One of the men beside the wall slowly reached for the lantern hook, but the man in black lifted 2 fingers without looking at him, and the hand froze midair. Outside, more shapes moved in the dark. Mara caught the faint scrape of paws on packed snow, the soft jingle of something metal, maybe harness rings, maybe tools, then silence again. The porch groaned under shifting weight. Whoever stood out there was not alone. The man in black finally opened the door wider, just enough to let the cold flood in and bleach the room pale. Snow drove across the threshold in little stinging needles. A tall figure stood at the front of the porch, broad-shouldered and still, hood drawn low enough to shadow the face. Frost clung to the hem of his coat. At his back, 2 others waited in a half-circle, motionless as sentries. The tall one's gaze passed over the room once, then landed on Mara. She felt it like a hand closing around the back of her neck. Not rough. Precise. Measuring. We were told, he said, there is a woman inside who opened the gate and let her scent be seen. Mara's mouth went dry. No one in the room moved. The fire hissed and spat in the grate. The man in black shifted one step between her and the open door, and the movement was so quick, so controlled, that it could have been mistaken for nothing at all if the room had not gone tighter around it. She stays here, he said. The tall stranger tilted his head, and in the lantern light the edge of his profile sharpened, straight nose, cold mouth, a scar pale against one cheek. That was not your decision. A pause. The porch wind slipped through the crack in the door and lifted the hem of Mara's skirt with a cold touch against her shin. Then the stranger spoke again, and this time the words landed like a blade set carefully on a table. Our Alpha wants to speak to her. The room changed. Mara saw it in the smallest motions first, the flick of a jaw, the tightening of a hand, the way the man in black's shoulders went rigid beneath his coat. One of the men by the wall stepped forward without thinking, then stopped when the stranger outside lifted two fingers and held them in the air. Not a threat. A command. The porch went still as stone. Mara felt the air thin around her, every sound sharpening, the pop of sap in the fire, the faint rattle of the window latch, the restless brush of snow across the roof. Your Alpha, the man in black repeated. The stranger's eyes did not leave Mara. He was outside this house before any of you knew he was near it. Then, with a glance toward the dark beyond the porch, he added, and he does not like being kept waiting. Mara's fingers curled against the table edge until her knuckles ached. She had come to this house because the storm had swallowed the road and the lights inside had promised shelter. She had not come to be looked at like a message, or a problem, or a prize passed between men who spoke in calm voices over a frozen threshold. The man in black inhaled once, slow and deliberate, as if the scent in the room had finally become readable to him. Then he turned his head slightly toward her, just enough for Mara to catch the hard line of his cheek. Stay behind me, he said. But before she could answer, the stranger on the porch stepped aside, and the darkness beyond him shifted. Something larger moved there. Not rushed. Not uncertain. The snow stopped blowing for one breath, as if the storm itself had held still to make room for it. A second later, a voice came from the dark, deep enough to vibrate in the doorframe, calm enough to be dangerous. Mara, it said, as if he already knew her. Come out before I come in. Mara stopped just inside the doorway, where the cold from the porch met the warmer air of the house and turned into a faint veil of damp breath. The room beyond was dim, lit by two oil lamps on a scarred wooden table, their flames trembling against the glass and throwing gold over the walls. 3 men stood inside. One in black, still as a fence post. 2 others near the hearth, their shoulders broad beneath thick coats dusted with melting snow. The one in the doorway had already stepped aside, but his presence still pressed at the threshold like a hand. You heard him, the man in black said, not looking at her. Stay behind me. Mara kept her fingers wrapped around the strap of her satchel until the leather bit into her palm. She had crossed half the county for this room, for this address, for the promise of a bed and work from a woman who had never arrived. Instead, she had found a house full of strangers and a storm that seemed unwilling to leave the doorstep. The tallest man near the hearth looked her over once, slow and blunt, then tipped his chin toward the dark window. If she comes in, the house is sealed, he said. His voice was quiet, but the words landed hard. Mara's gaze flicked to the frost edging the panes, silver and brittle, and to the iron latch on the door behind her. It had already frozen halfway open. She took one careful step farther inside, and the boards beneath her boots gave a low groan. The man in black turned then, and the oil light caught the edge of his face. Not young. Not easy. His eyes were sharp enough to cut through the dim. Who sent you? He asked. No one, Mara said. The answer came out steady, though her throat had gone dry from the stove heat and the smell of wet wool. A faint scent drifted through the room then, something clean and wild beneath the smoke, like pine snapped in winter air. It came from the dark figure on the porch. He had not entered yet. He did not need to. The whole house seemed to lean toward him. The man in black noticed Mara watching the threshold and shifted one hand lower, where it disappeared beneath his coat. "Do not answer anyone until I tell you to," he said. "And if they ask you to stay, you do exactly the opposite." One of the men by the hearth gave a short, humorless laugh. "That advice would mean more if you weren't the one who brought her here." Mara's head turned. "Brought her here." The words slid through her like cold water. She looked from one face to another, searching for the truth in the way they stood, in the way none of them fully faced the porch. Outside, the wind struck the house in a hard sheet, and snow tapped softly against the glass like fingertips. The tall man by the hearth reached for the poker, not to strike, but to hook the heavy iron bar across the inner latch. "It's not safe to leave her out there," he muttered. "And it's not safe to let her stand here either." Mara's eyes narrowed. No one had told her she was walking into a trap, only that she would find shelter. She shifted the satchel higher on her shoulder and took another step in, enough to make the lampshade flicker. "I'm not staying where I'm not wanted," she said. The room went still. Even the wind seemed to thin outside. Then, from the porch, the deep voice answered her through the open crack in the door. "No one said you were unwanted." The words were calm, but they filled the house like a held note. Mara looked toward the shadow beyond the threshold. She still couldn't see his face clearly, only the outline of a tall frame and the line of one hand resting against the doorframe. The skin there was bare despite the snow, and the air around it looked colder somehow, as if the storm obeyed him. The man in black did not turn, but his jaw tightened. "She is not part of this," he said. "She is now," came the reply from the porch. There was a scrape of boot leather against frozen wood. One step. Then another. The figure outside moved closer, but not in haste. The darkness peeled away just enough to show a broad shoulder, the glint of a watch chain at his waist, and a scar across one knuckle where the lamplight touched it. Mara's breath caught before she could stop it. There was something unmistakable about the way the others changed when he moved. Not fear exactly. Something older. A pause. A yielding. The man in black finally faced the doorway. "If you come inside, you follow my rules," he said. The reply came without hesitation. "If I come inside, there will be no more rules for anyone who touched her name." Mara looked sharply at the man in black, then back at the silhouette in the snow. Her name. She had not even given it to anyone in this house. The tall man by the hearth lowered the poker an inch, staring between them as if waiting for one of them to deny it. Instead, the porch figure stepped into the amber spill of the nearest lamp. His coat was dark, his collar rimmed with ice, and his face emerged slowly from shadow, cut by hard angles and winter light. Not a stranger. Not to them. Mara saw it in the way the man in black did not speak, in the way the others dipped their heads a fraction too late. The newcomer's eyes found hers and held. "You made it to the door," he said. "That's the hard part." Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a brass key, old and polished by use, holding it out between them. "Take it," he said. "It opens the room upstairs. And if you want to leave after tonight, you can." Mara did not move. The key lay in his palm, catching the lamp fire, while the wind pressed at the walls and the stove hissed softly in the corner. The man in black said nothing, but his hand shifted away from his coat at last. Mara looked once toward the frozen latch, once toward the men watching her from the hearth, then back to the key. She took one step forward and reached for it. The moment her fingers touched his, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and every head turned toward the porch as another set of footsteps crunched in the snow outside. The new footsteps on the porch stopped just beyond the door, and for a breath the whole house seemed to hold its own air. Mara's fingers were still wrapped around the brass key when the man in black slid one step toward the entryway, placing himself between her and the frozen latch without making a show of it. The lantern above the table flickered, throwing gold over the edges of his coat and the hard line of his jaw. Outside, snow tapped softly against the glass like fingertips. Then the porch board creaked again. "Open it," a voice called from beyond the door. Low. Flat. Not a plea, but close enough to one that even the men by the hearth went still. Mara looked at the key in her hand. It was colder than the room around it, the metal biting through her glove. One of the strangers near the fire pushed off the wall and gave her a careful glance, as though waiting to see whether she would run or obey. "He's not asking twice," the man in black said, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear it. Mara turned the key once in her palm, then took the long brass chain from the lock and slipped it free. The sound it made was sharp in the room, a tiny metallic ring that seemed louder than the wind. She crossed the threshold to the inner hall before anyone stopped her, one hand brushing the rough plaster wall for balance. The hallway beyond was dim and colder, the air carrying damp cedar, wood smoke, and old stone. At the far end stood a closed door she had not noticed before, its frame marked by scratches near the latch, as if many hands had tried and failed to open it. Mara reached for the knob. It was warm. Too warm. She looked back over her shoulder just as the man in black lifted his hand and shut the parlor door behind her, sealing out the murmurs and the firelight in a single soft click. "If you go in there," he said, "you do it by choice." A second set of footsteps crossed the porch outside, heavier this time. Then another. Mara's grip tightened on the key. She pressed the knob down, and the door gave with a slow, heavy sigh, releasing a breath of cold air that carried the sharp scent of pine and something wild beneath it. The room beyond was only half lit by a single lamp on the far table, its glass chimney trembling with the draft. A blanket lay folded on the bed. A kettle steamed over a small iron stove. And by the window, where moonlight spilled silver across the floorboards, stood a man with his back to her, one hand braced against the frame as if he had only just turned away from the glass. He was broad-shouldered, still, and listening. Mara did not step inside at first. The floorboards near the threshold were dusted with a fine line of tracked snow, and beside them, half hidden under the rug, she saw something dark and frayed wrapped around the leg of the bed. A restraint strap. Her gaze flicked to the man in black behind her, but he was no longer in the doorway. He had moved to the hall, leaving her alone with the quiet room and the stranger by the window. "You came," the man at the glass said, without turning. His voice was the same one from the porch. Close. Controlled. That was brave, or foolish. "I'm still deciding." Mara set the key on the nearest table with care. It landed beside a chipped bowl and a folded note she could not read from where she stood. The lamp flame shivered, and the room seemed to narrow around the silence between them. Then the man by the window finally turned. He was older than she expected, not by much, but enough to wear exhaustion plainly in the lines around his mouth and eyes. Yet there was nothing weak in the way he moved. One step and the floor felt it. Another and the air seemed to tighten. He wore no coat now, only a dark shirt rolled at the forearms, and at his throat Mara caught a glimpse of a pale mark, half hidden by the collar. He saw her looking and raised 2 fingers to it before letting his hand fall. "You don't know what's in this house," he said. "But you opened the door anyway." Mara kept one hand on the knob behind her. The wood was rough under her palm, the only steady thing in the room. "You asked me to come inside," she said. His gaze moved to the key on the table, then to her face. "I asked if you wanted to leave after tonight." Outside, something moved through the snow with a slow, deliberate crunch. Not one person now. Several. The sound carried through the wallboards and into the room like a warning. The man by the window went still. The smallest change came over his face then, not fear, not quite, but recognition sharpened to a point. He crossed to the bed in 3 quick strides and reached beneath the mattress. When he came back up, there was a heavy iron rod in his hand, worn smooth at the grip. Mara's eyes followed it, then the hallway, then the key again. "Who are they?" she asked. He looked at her as if the answer should have been obvious from the shape of the night itself. "The ones you let in," he said. The porch boards groaned. A fist struck the outer door once, not hard, but enough to rattle the frame. Then a voice from outside, clearer now, carried through the cold with a strange, almost respectful calm. "Open the door," it called. "The pack is here for our brother." The lamp flame jumped high. Mara felt the room shift around that one word. "Brother." The man by the window did not move to answer, but the hand wrapped around the iron rod tightened until the muscles in his forearm stood out under the sleeve. From the hall, the man in black reappeared without a sound, closing the distance to stand near Mara's shoulder. His face was unreadable in the dim light, but his eyes tracked the door with a focus that made the room feel even smaller. "Now you understand," he said softly. Mara did not turn. The cold brass key pressed into her palm, and she closed her fingers around it until the teeth bit into her skin. Another knock hit the outer door, this one steady and patient, as if whoever stood outside had all night to wait. Then, from somewhere beneath the floorboards, came a low answering sound, deep enough to vibrate through the soles of her boots. The man by the window lifted his head at once. So did the one in black. Mara looked from one to the other, and for the first time, the silence in the room felt less like stillness and more like a gate about to open. The man at the window took the iron rod in both hands and said, very quietly, "Stay where you are." But the porch door groaned under the next push, and the latch began to give. The latch gave with a dry crack, and the porch door swung inward just enough to spill a slice of white frost across the floor. Mara flinched at the blast of cold air. It carried the sharp smell of pine sap and snowmelt, and beneath that, something stranger, clean fur, wet earth, and the metallic sting of a storm about to break. The man in black moved first, stepping to the threshold with the iron rod raised, while the one by the window kept his shoulders angled toward the floorboards as if the sound from below could rise at any second. Outside, a shape shifted in the blue darkness. Not one shape. Several. The first body that pushed against the opening was hunched and shaking, its coat glazed with frost so thick the fur looked silver. A second and third figure crowded behind it, both too still to be ordinary men waiting in the snow. Mara took one step forward before she could stop herself. The cold hit her bare wrists, and the key in her hand grew numb against her palm. "Don't," the man by the window said without looking at her. But the nearest frozen stranger lifted his head, and for one impossible second the porch light caught eyes that flashed amber before the lids lowered again. "Please," he rasped, voice rough as wind over ice. "Let us in before dawn." Mara stared at the line of them, at the way their breath came in hard white bursts, at the frost clinging to their lashes and the dark streaks of melted snow running down their sleeves. One of them pressed a hand to the doorframe. The fingers were bare. Human. Then the hand tightened, and the knuckles shifted under the skin with a subtle, unsettling strength that made Mara's stomach turn over. The man in black saw it too. He planted the rod across the opening. "No one comes farther until I know who you are." Another gust slammed against the porch, rattling the panes. Somewhere outside, a low answering howl rolled through the trees, not loud, but deep enough to make the glass tremble. The frozen men inside the threshold all went rigid. The one in front swallowed hard, his throat working against the cold. "If we stay out there," he said, "we will not make it to sunrise." Mara looked from his face to the snow crusted on his shoulders, to the way his jaw clenched as if he were holding something much larger than a plea behind his teeth. He was not dressed like a hunter. Not like a traveler either. His coat was too fine beneath the ice, the seams too tailored, the cuff at his wrist stitched with a black thread that caught the lamplight in a narrow silver edge. The house felt smaller with every breath he took. From beneath the floorboards, the answering sound rose again, deeper this time, and the man by the window finally turned. "They found the trail," he said. "Which means they've found us." Mara's gaze snapped to him. Us? The word barely left her mouth before the frozen stranger in front of her shifted his stance, and a burst of steam rolled from the collar of his coat as if heat had flared under the skin and vanished just as quickly. He was shivering, but not from weakness alone. There was tension in the way he stood, a coiled restraint that made the hair at Mara's neck lift. The man in black leaned close to the opening and sniffed once, his eyes narrowing at the scent on the wind. Moonpack, he muttered. And there are too many. The stranger's jaw tightened. Then open the door and let us move. No, the reply came flat and immediate. The rod stayed braced across the gap. Frost crept over the threshold, white and creeping, and one of the figures outside let out a low, frustrated sound that was almost a growl, though it ended in a cough. Mara could see now that his hands were shaking badly. Not a drunk's shake. Not fear alone. The kind that came when the body had spent too long in the cold and was beginning to fail. Something in her tightened at the sight of it. She set the brass key on the table by the door, but before she could reach for the latch, the man in black said, "Mara, stay back." His voice had changed. Not softer. Sharper. As if he could hear more than she could. A second later, the porch boards creaked under a weight just beyond the light. Heavy boots. Then another. The frozen strangers outside went silent as though the whole night had taken a breath and held it. The lead man glanced past Mara, not at her face but at the room behind her, at the shadows gathered near the hearth and the narrow stair leading up. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "You already know what we are," he said. "What matters is whether you want to live through tonight." Mara's fingers curled around the edge of the table. The wood was rough under her skin, splintered in one spot where an old knife had nicked it. A draft slithered through the gap in the door and touched her ankles like ice water. She looked at the men outside, at the frost clinging to their coats and the hunger of the dark behind them, then at the two inside who had gone still with the kind of readiness that made the air itself feel armed. The man in black gave one short nod toward the threshold. "Choose fast," he said. "Because if they come in, none of us gets to pretend anymore." The frozen stranger on the porch took one step closer, and the lamplight caught the sharp line of his mouth as it changed, just for a blink, into something unmistakably inhuman before he forced it back into place. Mara saw it. The room saw it. And then the man by the window reached down beneath the floorboards, pulled up a long, carved handle slick with old wax, and said, "All right. Open the door." The door stayed open just long enough for the cold to rush in like a living thing. Mara's hand remained on the latch, her fingers stiff from the metal's bite, while the stranger on the porch lowered his chin and stepped over the threshold with careful, measured grace. Snow clung to the hem of his dark coat, melting into tiny dark spots on the worn floorboards. Behind him, the night pressed against the windowpanes, and the two men inside did not move until the woman by the stove set down the iron poker with a soft, deliberate clink. "Take off your gloves," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut clean through the room. The stranger obeyed. Pale hands. Scarred knuckles. Not a laborer's scars, Mara noticed. The man by the window saw the same thing and shifted his weight, the carved handle still in his grip. Outside, three silhouettes lingered beyond the porch light, their boots making no sound on the crusted snow. One of them knocked once, slow and polite, and the sound was wrong somehow, too controlled, too patient. The stranger on the floorboard looked toward the window, then at Mara. "They won't stay frozen forever," he said. "You need to decide whether you're hiding from them or with us." Mara glanced at the stove. A kettle trembled over the flame, its lid rattling with a thin metal cough. The room smelled of pine sap, wet wool, and the sharp mineral sting of thawing snow. She crossed to the wall, pulled down the lantern, and carried it toward the back room without speaking. The man by the window followed one step behind, and the stranger's eyes tracked the movement of the carved handle as if he recognized it. "You know what's in the floor," he said. It was not a question. The woman by the stove answered before anyone else could. Enough to keep the wrong thing out. Another knock struck the door. This time the frame shuddered. Frost flaked from the top panel and drifted down like white ash. Mara set the lantern on the table and reached beneath it for the cloth-wrapped bundle she had hidden there hours ago, when the first footprints appeared in the yard. Inside was a key, blackened with age, its teeth wrapped in red thread. The stranger's gaze fixed on it. The room seemed to tighten around that small shape. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Mara looked from the key to the door, then to the man with the carved handle. He was watching her now with an expression that had gone hard around the mouth, as if some private line had just been crossed. "It was in the crate," she said. "Along with your name." The words landed with a quiet weight. For the first time, the stranger's composure slipped. Not much. Just enough for the lantern flame to catch the edge of something raw in his eyes. Another sound moved outside, low, collective, a murmur under the wind. The silhouettes beyond the porch light drew closer, and their shadows stretched thin and tall across the frost. The woman by the stove moved first. She slid a bolt across the back door, then another, her movements brisk and practiced. The man by the window crossed the room, took the key from Mara's hand, and held it up to the light. The red thread around its teeth had frayed, but not enough to hide the tiny mark carved into the metal, a crescent moon split by a vertical line. The stranger inhaled once, sharply. "That opens the cellar," he said. "Not ours," the woman answered. "The one beneath the house." Mara turned toward the floorboards, toward the old seams in the wood that had always looked a little too straight to be natural. She had lived in this house for 11 winters and never once thought to question the iron ring set flush beside the pantry shelf. Now the ring seemed to gleam under the lantern glow, as if it had been waiting for a hand to find it. The knocking came again. Harder. The front door bowing inward against the latch. Snow dusted from the top frame and landed on Mara's sleeve, cold enough to sting. The stranger stepped in front of her without asking. His shoulders filled the narrow space between her and the door, and when he reached for the carved handle the air changed at once, warmer, heavier, charged with a pressure that made the lantern flame bend sideways. The woman by the stove drew in a breath and spoke in a tone that left no room for argument. "If they get in, go below." Mara looked at the man in black, then at the stranger, then at the key in his hand. "Why?" she asked. The answer came not from the man, but from the floor beneath her feet. A low thud rolled through the boards, deep enough to rattle the spoon in the kettle and wake a thin drift of dust from the rafters. Something was moving under the house. Something that had been listening. The stranger's jaw tightened. He slid the blackened key into Mara's palm, curling her fingers over it before she could pull away. "Because they're not here for the door," he said. "They're here for what you've been standing on." The key in Mara's palm was cold enough to sting through her skin. Below the house, the thudding came again, one slow through the boards, then another, making the iron kettle tremble against the stove and sending a fine shiver of ash across the hearthstone. The stranger in black moved first. He crossed the narrow kitchen in 2 silent strides and set his shoulder to the back door as if he meant to hold back a storm. "No one opens this door unless I say so," he told the room, his voice low and hard as iron scraped over wood. The woman by the stove, Nell, as Mara had heard one of them call her earlier, snatched a blanket from the hook and shoved it toward Mara without looking at her. "Wrap that around the window," she said. "And keep your hands off the latch." Outside, the wind dragged snow across the porch in a soft, constant hiss. Inside, the air had turned close and sharp, carrying the scent of wet wool, pine smoke, and something wild underneath it all, something that made the hairs at Mara's neck rise. She turned the key over once. The blackened teeth were etched with a shape she had not noticed before, a crescent hooked around a narrow vertical line, like a moon guarding a gate. Another thud rolled up from beneath the floorboards, this one closer to the stove. A crack appeared in the dust on the planks, thin as a thread. Mara crouched before she meant to, pressing her fingers to the seam between 2 boards. The wood was warm there. Not from the fire. From below. What is under this house? She asked. No one answered right away. The stranger's gaze flicked to the corner near the sink, then to the window where the frozen panes glowed blue with moonlight. The candle flame leaned hard to one side, as if something unseen had moved through the kitchen and stolen its breath. Then Nell said, "A door that should never have been buried." She said it like she regretted every word. Mara's fingers tightened around the key. The boards gave another heavy knock, and this time the sound carried a rhythm, 3 beats, a pause, then one long scrape, slow and deliberate, like claws testing old timber from the other side. The stranger reached under the table and dragged out a narrow iron bar, placing it across the chair legs with a careful, practiced motion. "They've found us," he said. "Or they've found what's left of the lock." Mara looked from his face to Nell's, searching for the joke, the trick, the explanation that would make this make sense. None came. Only the wind outside, the groan of the rafters, and the steady, urgent pressure rising through the floor. Nell crossed to the window and ripped the blanket wide, pinning it over the glass with a brass nail. When she stepped back, the kitchen darkened by half, and the blue moonlight was cut into a thin, trembling edge along the cloth. "If the house opens," she said, "do not step into the circle." Mara started to ask what circle, but the floor answered for her. A ring of frost spread outward from the seam beneath the table, white and intricate, blooming across the wood in a pattern like branches made of ice. It moved fast, too fast, tracing a complete circle around the center planks. The black key in her hand went suddenly hot. Mara dropped it with a gasp, and it hit the floor with a sharp metallic click. The moment it landed, every sound in the room vanished. The kettle stopped trembling. The wind outside seemed to fall silent. Even the fire in the stove went still, its flames frozen in a bent shape like a bow pulled taut. Then, from beneath the house, came a voice. Not loud. Not human in the ordinary sense. Deep enough to feel in the bones. "Bring her down." Nell went rigid. The stranger's hand closed around the iron bar so hard his knuckles whitened. Mara stared at the floor, at the frost circle, at the key lying in its center as if the house itself had placed it there. "Who said that?" she whispered. The answer was a long, scraping sound under the boards, and then a second voice joined the first, closer, roughened by cold. "Open the lock," it said. "Or we come up." The stranger swore under his breath and moved before the last word had faded. He seized the key, shoved the iron bar into Mara's hands, and pointed to the back corner where the pantry door stood half open in the dark. "Get behind the shelves," he said. "If the floor gives, don't run toward the front." Mara did not move at once. The frost beneath her boots had begun to creep, touching the legs of the table, the chair, the stove, cold enough to bite. She looked at the pantry, then back at him. "Why me?" The stranger's jaw flexed once. He looked toward the floor, where the frozen ring now gleamed like a white scar in the dim kitchen, and when he answered, his voice was almost a warning. "Because the lock knows your blood." A violent cracked through the boards. One plank lifted at the edge, then slammed back down, and from below came the sound of something shifting its weight in the dark. Mara caught the iron bar in both hands and stepped backward toward the pantry, the wood under her boots slick with frost, the air around her suddenly thick with pine smoke and old cold stone. Nell reached for her wrist, but the kitchen gave a sharp, splintering groan, and the seam in the floor split open by a finger's width, letting up a breath of air so frigid it fogged Mara's eyes. She saw it then, just for a second, beneath the gap, not dirt, not cellar boards, but polished stone, carved with the same crescent mark as the key. And beside it, a handprint in the frost, large enough to cover both of hers. From somewhere below, a chain rattled once, then went taut. The stranger barked one word, sharp and final. "Now." The chain below went still as Mara drove the iron bar into the seam and shoved with both hands. Frost bit through her palms. The pantry door rattled behind her, and the old house let out a low moan as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then the floor gave way in a clean, bright crack, not into darkness but into a stone stairwell lit by blue lamps burned low in iron brackets. Cold rushed up first, sharp enough to sting her throat, followed by the scent of pine resin, wet stone, and something wild beneath it all. Nell seized Mara's sleeve, but it was the stranger who climbed the first step from below. He was taller up close, his coat dusted with ice, his dark hair falling across a face cut by wind and sleepless nights. His eyes flicked once to Mara, then to the frozen wheat talismans hanging over the stove. "You should not have seen this," he said. Mara kept the bar raised, though her wrists trembled from the effort. "Then maybe your wolves should stop knocking holes in my floor." One corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile, and he reached into his coat slowly, palm open, not for a weapon but for a key of black iron. The storm sealed the valley road. "My people are trapped in the ridge tunnels. Your cellar is the only way through." Nell blinked hard. "Your people?" The man turned, and when he did, the lantern light caught the silver mark at his throat, the same crescent Mara had seen beneath the floor, the same shape pressed into the frozen handprint. He lowered his head once, a gesture so formal it changed the air in the kitchen. "My name is Kale. These mountains answer to my pack." Mara looked from the key to the split boards to the wolf tracks frozen into the mud outside the window. The house had carried her alone through 3 winters, and now it stood between her and a truth too large to fit inside the kitchen walls. Another tremor rolled through the beams. Dust drifted from the rafters like ash. Kale was already moving, one hand braced against the stone, his voice low and steady. "There are children below, and elders with lungs full of smoke. If the passage stays blocked, they will not make sunrise." Mara set the iron bar down. The clang rang through the room, clear and final. "Then show me." For the first time, Kale's gaze held on her face long enough to change. He did not rush her. He stepped aside and let her go first down the stairwell, a courtesy so careful it seemed older than the house itself. The stone stairs were slick with frost, the walls sweating cold. Every step carried the sound of distant wind pressing through tunnels, and with each one the blue lanterns deepened the shadows around them. At the bottom, the passage opened into a wide chamber cut from bedrock, where 6 figures waited in fur-lined cloaks, their breaths clouding in the dark. A boy with a split lip clung to a woman's coat. An older man sat against the wall with his head tipped back, one hand over his ribs. When the pack saw Kale, their shoulders eased at once. When they saw Mara, they tightened again, wary and unsure. Kale lifted the black iron key. "Open the south gate." The older woman in the chamber shook her head. "It's frozen shut." "Then we do it from here," Kale said, and his voice carried the same command the kitchen floor had obeyed. Mara crouched beside the man on the ground. His breath came thin and ragged, each inhale rough against the stone. She pulled the wool wrap from her own neck and folded it over his mouth and nose, then dragged a jug from the wall cistern and pressed it into the woman's hands. "Warm water," she said. "Not too hot. Let him sip." The woman stared, then obeyed. Mara worked without asking permission, loosening scarves, spreading blankets, propping the boy near the brazier, dragging a crate closer so the older man could sit up easier. The chamber shifted around her. Not softening, not yet. But opening. Kale watched her move through the pack like she belonged to the work, not the title. He crossed to the south wall and drove the black key into a hidden slot behind a frozen slab of stone. The lock answered with a deep, grinding click. A gust burst inward, white and violent, blowing flame sideways in the lamps. Beyond the gate, more wolves waited in the tunnel, their silhouettes half human, half beast, sheltering behind one another against the storm. For one suspended second, no one moved. Then Kale stepped through the opening and offered his hand back to Mara. "They need a healer with steady hands," he said. "And I need the woman who did not turn away when the house shook." Mara looked at his hand, then at the pack beyond the gate. The same people who had once stared at her as if she were nothing now stood silent, watching whether she would choose to help them or leave them with their fear. She put her fingers into his palm. His hand was warm despite the cold, rough at the knuckles, steady as the stone beneath them. Together they crossed into the tunnel. The storm had gathered in the passage, but the walls held. Cale guided the pack through in careful order, one by one, his voice low and direct. Mara stayed at his side, passing blankets, tying scarves, pressing her mug of broth into trembling hands. When a young woman stumbled, Mara caught her elbow. When the boy with the split lip shivered too hard to stand, Cale lifted him without a word and carried him himself, his jaw set, his steps measured so the child would not be jostled. By the time the last of them reached the kitchen, dawn had begun to thin the black outside the windows. Pale light spilled across the floorboards, catching on the frost and turning it to silver. The house, once crowded with silence and suspicion, was full of breath now, of cups clinking, wet coats warming by the stove, low voices asking after one another. Nell stood by the table with tears in her eyes, folding clean towels into neat stacks. Cale came to the center of the kitchen and removed his coat. Without it, the scar across his shoulder showed briefly in the lantern glow, a white line that disappeared beneath his shirt. He did not hide it. He did not need to. This woman opened her door when the valley turned its back on us, he said, and every head in the room turned toward Mara. She gave warmth before she was given truth. She fed my pack before she knew my name. The words landed like a bell struck in still air. Mara did not move. The room seemed to wait with her. Cale reached for the black iron key, held it between them, then laid it in her palm and closed her fingers around it. The house is yours, he said. And so is the road through these mountains, as long as you want it. Mara looked down at the key, cold as winter in her hand, then back at him. The blue marks at his throat had faded in the dawn. He was no longer the stranger in the dark stairwell. He was the man who had carried his people through ice and fear, and who had stepped down to her kitchen as if trust were the first law worth keeping. She opened her hand again and let the key rest there, then set it on the table between them where the sunlight touched it. A house is only walls, she said. If the door stays closed. Cale's gaze softened, and this time the smile reached it fully. He took one step closer, slow enough that she could have stopped him. Instead, Mara reached up and smoothed the frost from the collar of his shirt with the back of her knuckles. It was a small touch, barely there, but it seemed to steady the whole room. Outside, the storm finally broke. Light spilled over the ridge in a clean band of gold, striking the snow so bright it made everyone blink. Somewhere beyond the hill, a wolf called once, long and clear, and another answered from farther away, then another, until the valley carried the sound like a promise held and answered. Cale leaned down, forehead nearly touching hers, and spoke so only she could hear. Then open the door with me. Mara turned toward the threshold, where the morning waited, and when she did, the whole house seemed to breathe with her.